Good afternoon. Did you know that wildfires in 2017 burned almost 10 million acres, according to the National Interagency Fire Center? My name's Newell. I spent 11 years as a wildland firefighter, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about wildfires, how they're classified, how they start, and how they're suppressed, as well as the resources that are used to suppress them. So wildfires are a phenomenon that have been around for a long time, but have gained more and more attention in recent years due to their increasing severity and their effect on not only on the forests, but on the people who recreate in the forests and the ecosystems and what's called the wildland-urban interface, which is when modern society starts encroaching on the wildlands and more homes are put at risk. So in order to understand wildfires and their role and how they're suppressed, we're going to talk, number one, about how fires are classified. Number two, we'll talk about how fires start. There's two general categories that they fall into. We're going to talk about some of the tactics that are used, which is somewhat variable based on the fire and based on the type of fire. And we're going to talk about the resources that are used to implement those tactics. So to start, wildfires are broken up into three main categories. So there's forest fires, brush fires, and grass fires. Forest fires are typically the hottest, most aggressively burning fires, but they also move the slowest. They're more frequent in the western United States, in areas owned by the Forest Service and large tracts of timberland. Brush fires are kind of an intermediary. They burn very quickly, as recent news has shown in California, but they're prevalent in California and the desert Southwest. They can be very fast moving, but they can also burn with considerable intensity. Whereas grass fires are quicker moving, but lower intensity. So typically they're easier to put out because they burn not as hot as the other fires, but they do burn very fast. So these are more prevalent in grasslands and in some of the middle United States. So now that we know that the three general classifications of how fires are classified, we'll talk a little bit more about how fires start. So according to the National Interagency Fire Center, 90% of wildfire starts are caused by humans. So this includes things like accidental starts, from throwing a cigarette out the window to a burn pile getting away, to things like arson. So the natural caused fires are typically caused by lightning. There's a few other natural causes of fires, but primarily that's going to be lightning. We're going to talk more today about human-caused fires because they're typically the ones that are more detrimental to society. They typically start in areas where there's more humans, more population, more recreation, and more homes, versus a lot of the lightning starts are deep in the forest and much more remote, and sometimes they're let burn because many ecosystems have evolved with fire. So human-caused and natural-caused, but we're primarily going to focus on human-caused fires that are detrimental to society. Not to say that natural fires can't be detrimental and are suppressed, but we're going to focus primarily on the human-caused. So when suppressing a fire, tactically there's several different options, and they depend a lot on the fire that you're fighting. So fire responds to different variables, like the weather, like the fuel type, and like the terrain, differently. So fires will burn faster and more aggressively upslope. They'll burn with the winds. So if you have high winds, dry temperatures, steep hillsides, fires are going to burn very aggressively. Whereas if it's a more moist climate, no winds, flatter terrain, it's going to burn much more moderately. So this dictates the strategies and tactics that are used by fire managers. So in a fire that doesn't burn very aggressively, firefighters will use what's called direct strategy. So they'll put in direct handline, which means they're actually on the edge of the fire, constructing fire line, which is simply removing the vegetation, the brush, timber, grass, anything that will carry the fire. They're physically removing that from the edge of the fire. And that can be done with tools like chainsaws and plaskies and hoes and shovels, or it can be done with machinery like bulldozers. So that is a tactic that's used when fire behavior is more moderate. When fire behavior is more aggressive, it's not safe or effective to put firefighters right on the fire edge. So if you get really aggressive fire behavior, as we've seen recently in California, firefighters will employ an indirect method. So in that case, they'll back off to natural barriers like lakes or rivers or roads that are already in place, and they will burn out, literally light the ground on fire between the fuel break they already have and the fire. So what this does is it eats up all the fuel between the main fire and the line that you want it to stop, and in theory, the fire will hit that and go out because there's no more fuel to burn. And obviously, it's not always that easy, but that's the general strategy with an indirect strategy. So in order to employ these tactics, there's a complement of resources that fire managers have access to. There's things as simple as fire engines, which you see all over the news. They're essentially big trucks that carry water and pumps and hoses and can spray the fire out or spray the grass and the trees, and making them so moist that fire will not burn in them. You'll see hand crews, which are typically 20-person crews of men and women carrying shovels and chainsaws, and they do a lot of the manual labor and are typically deployed to the remote areas of the fire where there's no roads. You'll see helicopters being used, and so they're used to access remote parts of the fire or to drop water where engines can't get to. You'll also see dozers, which help with constructing the fire line around the fire, and you'll see a lot of fixed-wing air tankers, which drop the fire retardant along the edge to help slow the fire down. So, in conclusion, there's three main types of fire. There's forest fires, there's brush fires, and there's grass fires. You can have a combination of all these three, but generally they'll fall into one of these three categories. There's different ways fires start. There's human and naturally caused fires. There's different tactics that are used based on the fire behavior that firefighters are seeing. And there's different resources that are utilized based on the tactics and based on the terrain and conditions. So I hope you learned a little more about firefighting. It's an emerging topic of today's climate, and I hope this informs you a little more and you'll pay a little more attention next time when you see it on the news. Thank you.